To all, good evening. Welcome to the monthly lecture series of Lalita Online Forum for Vaishnava Textual Studies. And today we have a great speaker from Germany. And before entering into the session, let me have the pleasure to invite Mrs. Patmanabhan from Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation, Chennai, for the welcome address.
Good evening to all. Respected President, Professor Srikala Nair, Head of the Department of Philosophy, Shankaracharya University, Kaladi, respected Swami Sri Hari Prasad Ji of Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation and Sri Jnanadvaita Peetham, Chennai, and Dr. Suganya Anandakrishnan of Hamburg University, the speaker of the day, scholars, professors, and dear friends. It is my great privilege today to welcome you all for the second edition of Lalita Online Forum for Vaishnavite Textual Studies. I extend a hearty welcome to Srikala ji, who is presiding over this forum and who is the moving spirit behind it. Welcome, ma'am. I also welcome Swami Sri Hari Prasad ji of Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation, who is a little tied up now, might join a little later. And he is blessing our endeavors. Pranam Swamiji. I now welcome the speaker for today, Dr. Suganya Anandakrishnan of Hamburg University. Dr. Suganya is no stranger to us at the Vishnu Mohan. We have enjoyed her delightful lectures over the past several years. I particularly remember a talk on Periyar's poetry. Professor Suganya, you made it come alive to us. Professor Suganya is a doctorate in Indology from Hamburg University, Tamil language and literature, religions of South Asia, Tamil Sanskrit interactions, Tamil Manipravalam texts, and lexicography. These are some of her areas of research. Dr. Suganya will be speaking on select verses from Tirumalizai Alvar's Nanmugan Tiruvandadi and Tiruchanda Vrittam. Now, over to Dr. Srikala for the presidential address. This forum also was inaugurated recently by Srimati Lakshmi Bai Nalavat of Trivandrum, and Professor C.T. Indra, who is here with us, was the first speaker. Now, over to Professor Srikalaji. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padmaji. Uh, Good evening to everyone. As my good friend Ms. Padma has said, it was uh, in the last month, 4th of September, that we have inaugurated this forum called Lalita Online Forum for Vaishnavite Textual Studies. Friends, I must admit that mm, it was a call from Lord Almighty Himself. I am illiterate as far as Tamil is concerned, very little informed on the Vaishnavite texts. All that I have heard little bit is whenever I come to Vishnu Mohan Foundation, there people like Dr. Sukanya and others have spoken, and I did hear them. And of course, as a philosophy student, I've studied. But other than that, my information was very, very bare minimum. But a thought came to me that as we encourage Sanskrit studies, the Mula Grantha, Pataha, Vyakyacha, in Sanskrit, I thought that a parallel effort has to be made with regard to Tamil textual tradition, particularly Vaishnava textual tradition, which is one of the ancient textual tradition in India. And it was Perumal himself probably who would have ordered me to undertake this divine task. And here we are. As Padma was remembering, it was uh, uh, inaugurated last month by the presence of Swamiji. I hope Swamiji will join us soon. And Professor C.T. Indra spoke on Amaranath Puran, his 10 verses, beautiful as they were. And this month we have an equally versatile scholar with us on Vaishnavite textile tradition. In the chat that we had just before the start of the program, I was pointing out that probably we did not have a scholarly person on, particularly in the South Indian Vaishnavite tradition, as Sukanya, someone who is strictly committed to the studies on this, and her competency and commitment. You know, it's very rare to find both in one single person, and we are very glad that you have kindly considered to deliver a talk in this forum. As she has been introduced by Padma ji, she's affiliated to Hamburg University, Germany, and this evening she has told us that she's going to speak on Tirumalai Alvar of 7th century and his two works, Nanmugan Tiruvandadi and Tiruchandaviritham. And as I was scanning through the net, I found her article on this Alvar. uh, I suppose it's been pronounced Tirumalachai.
Tirumushi.
Tirumarisai.
Tirumushi.
Tirumalachai, right?
Marisai.
Yeah.
Marisai. Tirumarisai.
Tirumali, Tirumalishai, right. And thus Alvar, who was under the story, all that Dr. Sukanya will deliver, where he himself, probably born of Brahmins, a Brahmin couple, but later brought up by a couple of lower caste. He declares himself as an Avarna who stands outside the boundaries of the Fukas, and therefore he has no means, no methods to have liberation. And in her paper, she says beautifully how the Alvard finds himself as being blessed to be born as an outcast, so that he can cling on to Lord's feet since he has not been given any other method. Being deprived of associated with one or the other caste, he has no other method. And therefore, he has the benefit of clinging on to Lord's feet, which made liberation all the more possible. And the other day she was conversing with me, and then she said there are, she was referring to the irreverent verses of the Alvar, and she was asking me if she could deliver all of them as they are. I said, of course, that is the way it should be. Where did the conflict between the Shaivites and the Vaishnavite at that time were all evident in his poetry. So we eagerly look forward to listen to. I still cannot pronounce the way the Tamils would pronounce the name of the Alvar. As she goes about pronouncing, I learn subsequently have to pronounce the name of the Alvar, and we eagerly await to listen to Dr. Sukanya and her deliverance on the irreverent verses of the Alvar of the 7th century. Over to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Padma ma'am, thank you for your introduction. And Sri Kala ma'am, thank you so much for having me here, for inviting me, and also for running after me. I was a bit busy, but I'm very glad that you persisted. I'm so happy to be here, and I would like to begin by an apology. I caught a cold, so I'm so very sorry. I'll be sneezing, sniffing, coughing, blowing my nose, and drinking water. I'm so sorry. You'll have to bear with that. And it's going to be a long talk. So you'll have to bear with me for quite some time. As I said, yes, it is going to be a long talk. I'll try to shorten it, especially if I go beyond 50 minutes. I'll start winding up. So don't worry. I'll usually don't go beyond the allotted time. So I'll begin to share, if I can, a PowerPoint presentation. I hope it works. And once I do that, because I'll be in presentators mode, I won't be able to see any of the audience, which is a bit, um, you know,
not quite wonderful because I won't be able to see anybody. I'll just be talking to myself. So I won't know your reactions like, oh, this is boring. Oh, she's talking too much. I'll never know. So I'll be careful about the time. So yeah, so let me just start by sharing the presentation. So it's here. So I had to do something very specific. This is it. So that you don't see the notes, but rather just my slides. Okay, don't show this again. So I think you can see it. Oh, I can see everybody. Very good. But good. So so this talk is going to be about one of the most spirited among the Arvas, and hopefully we will explore some of his provocative verses, cheeky verses tonight. So along with reading his verses, I will also try to understand him in his context, him meaning Tirumalizai Arvar. Um, so I will refer to verses from the Sangam Tamil text, it's classical, which is considered as a classical Tamil text, from his Shaiva counterparts, other Arvas, and I will also constantly keep an eye on how his words were received later on and interpreted and transmitted, especially by the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas in the second millennium. So I'll constantly go back and forth and go back and forth and then come back to Tirumalizai Arvar. Okay, so I won't just stick to him alone. For, as they say, no man is an island. So although the focus will be on reading verses by Tirumarisai, and I have selected 5 or 6 of him, which I think express his character, his most profound thoughts the best. I have still tried to structure the whole thing so that there's a certain logic to it. Okay, so I'll begin by introducing the Arva to you. And then I'll continue in the first part dealing with verses um, by Tirumalizai himself, in which he reveals something of his background and character. So through his own words, which will help us understand him and his verses better. And then I will focus on his provocative verses because his irreverence, I've already written about that. I think his irreverence is one of the elements that really stand out in his poetry, at least for me. And although today, as I said before, throughout the talk, I will see how the Sri Vaishnavacharyas perceived him, what they made of his words, and how they used them to recreate a certain persona of Tirumarisai, I will still set aside the third part to solely focus on how the Sri Vaishnavacharyas received his poetry in the second millennium. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Tirumarisai Arva. I'm sure many of you know him. So literally it means the Arva from Tirumarisai. It's one of the towns that's not very far from central Chennai. He was born there. He is one of the early Arvas and therefore one of the Bhakti poets closest to the Sangam period. And he also seems to be very well versed in Sangam literature. He was a younger contemporary of the first 3 Arvas, Poigai Arvar, Pei Arvar, Mudat Arvar, whom the eminent historian Nilakantha Shastri qualifies as, I'm quoting, remarkable for their non sectarian outlook and for the purity and gentleness of their devotion. Now, Tirumarisai's temperament is very different from theirs. He is controversial, to quote again Nilakantha Shastri, provocative at least, I think, and has no real patience with people who differ from him, as we shall see throughout. So it's the traditional belief that Tirumarisai Alvar composed 2 works, the Nanmohan Tiruvandadi and the Tiruchanda Virattam. But some modern scholars, like Freedom Hardy in his Viraha Bhakti, do not agree. They think that the differences between the 2 works seem to abound, linguistic differences, differences in terms of themes, etc. But I personally believe that there are more common points between them than people are able to see or they're willing to see. But that's a topic for another day. So in the meantime, I will assume that Tirumarisai Arva composed both these poems, especially since I'm also going to focus on the way that these poems were received in the second millennium, when the Sri Vaishnavas definitely believed in single authorship by Tirumarisai Arva. So today I will read a few verses, but keeping in mind certain questions that I will try to get answers for. Like, who was Tirumari Sayarwar based on his own words, especially in terms of his background and character? Why were his verses named controversial? How far does he follow the norms and examples set by his predecessors, for example, the Sangam poets and other Bhakti poets? Does he ever break away from that tradition? If he does, then how and why? Does he innovate? If so, how? And also, and importantly, how do the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas perceive him and interpret his words? I can see that somebody's sent a message, perhaps. I don't know. If I get out of PowerPoint, it'll be a problem. So I'm unable to see the comments. So these are some of the questions that I'm going to ask myself as I read these verses with you. So here's the plan. Now that I have introduced the Arva, so I'll first focus on Tirumarisi Arva's background, especially his social background, and then his religious background, which will tell us something about his character as well. Okay. So there you go. So the poet gives more information about himself than other early Arvas, I think, at least. He is rather explicit about his varna or caste. I'll use the term caste for the sake of convenience. So he claims to be an outcast, as Shrikala ma'am pointed out, an outcast who could not learn the Vedas, but he does not come across as being sorry for it. He's not bitter about it, nor does he hint that he feels inferior to the upper caste people on that account. Not at all. He's a free spirit. Let me read the verse and then the translation. குலங்களாய ஈரிரண்டில் ஒன்றிலும் பிறந்திலேன் நலங்களாய நற்கலைகள் நாளிலும் நவென்றிலேன் புலன்களைந்தும் வென்றிலேன் பொறியிலேன் புனிதனின் இலங்கு பாதம் அன்றி மற்றோர் பற்றிலேன் எம்மீசனே. So I have not been born in any of the four castes. I have not learned the four good Vedas. I, rooted in the sense organs, have not overcome the five senses. O pure one, I have not embraced anything other than your lustrous feet, our supreme being. So this is how I interpret this. Because he does not belong to any varna, especially not the top three varna, he could not learn the Vedas. Maybe as a consequence of this, he has not curbed his senses. So here, in the first three lines, he lists all the obstacles, or not all, at least some of the prominent obstacles that could hinder somebody who wants liberation. Because many of the means to liberation, for example, Bhakti Yoga, require a person to be a Trivarnika Upanita, an initiated man who belongs to the top three varnas. So Tirumarisai could be suggesting that he could not aspire for liberation taking that particular route. But in the last pada, Ilangu padam andri mattor patrilene mesane, the last pada, in the sense the last quarter, the dynamics change as the Arva claims to have embraced God's pada or feet as an alternative, which tips the balance in his favor and which is the only solution for people like himself not authorized to adopt another means like Bhakti Yoga. So Tirumari Sayarva may even be implying that it is a wonderful thing to be an outcast, because after all, getting liberation is made easier for him because the other means are notoriously difficult to perform and can take many births. Now, this doesn't really sound provocative, right? I've been saying that this is a very provocative poet. But if you were a Vedic Brahmin from the 7th century who believed in performing fire sacrifices and other such rituals, and certainly not in the worship of a god with a form in a temple and so forth, and you also did that sort of thing but expected liberation as a result, then you would probably have found this verse quite provocative. Anyway, that was just a passing comment. Now, Tirumarisi Arva's caste, his claim could be just symbolic, okay? So when you have no qualification to obtain liberation, there's still hope in the form of God. So anybody who finds himself incapable of, for example, performing Bhakti Yoga could symbolically call himself that. Or the poet could be exaggerating his own unworthiness, which should make grace more forthcoming. But it could simply be taken at face value because, maybe because he was an outcast. But what the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas make of it later on is very interesting. The hagiographic texts, like the Guru Parampara Prabhavams, tell us that a Tirumarisi Arva was born to a Brahmin couple, or at least a Brahmin father, depending on the version, who discarded him. And he survived thanks to Narayana's grace, and then was found and brought up by a bamboo cutter, a Shudra, not somebody who was outside the Varna system. Now, the motif of the exposed infant is common in many literatures of the world, especially of the ancient world. The abandoned child is usually rescued by someone, sometimes even by an animal, and brought up by the same person or a different person, and often by a social inferior. So in India, in the Mahabharata, for example, we have Karna abandoned by the young unwed Kunti. And in the Tamil world too, we have many examples. Like, for example, Thiruvalluvar, Ouvayar, the Sangam poet Kapilar, and also the Sangam chieftain Adyaman. They're all said to have been discarded at birth. And oftentimes they say that their father at least was a Brahmin. And actually, there's even one version of the story that says that they were all siblings born to a Brahmin father who kept, discarding them. Now, before the thing is, why is there such a motive, at least in this part of the world? So I guess there are many theories. I'm sure if it's across the world, there are many theories explaining such a phenomenon. One of which belongs to a Tamil scholar, Somasundara Bharati, who says the Brahmana hagiologists invented Brahmana connections and miraculous birth stories of saints and poets of non Brahmin origin in order to strengthen the myth of genetic and intellectual superiority of the Brahmana. Now, this seems plausible in the case, I mean, it's as good a theory as any other theory, and this seems plausible, especially in the case of the Tamil poets I just mentioned, not necessarily the Arvas. But is that why the Sri Vaishnava hagiographers, who very likely based their theory about the Arvas' birth on his verse that we just read, concocted, did they concoct such a story for Tirumarisi Arva for the same reason? I don't know. If it would, if that were to be the case, if the Sri Vaishnavas, why would they go out of their ways to make at least one of the Arvas an outcast? For example, Tirupan Arvar, whom you encountered last month, in his 10 verses, there's no hint about his caste at all. But the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas go out of their way to claim that he was an outcast. Okay, and then there is also Tirumangai Arva, who's referred to as a mlecha in the Arairapadi Guru Parampara Prabhavam. Actually, they seem to like it. They say, see, um, Sri Vaishnavism is open to everybody. Look, many of the Arvas are not Brahmin. See, it's wonderful. So they don't, And besides that, the greatest of all the Arvas, Nammarva, was also a Shudra according to the hagiographic stories. And yet the Sri Vaishnavas give his words the status of the Tamil Vedas, and these verses of all the Arvas are commented upon, recited in the temples, and all the Arvas are also worshipped inside many of the temples run by the Sri Vaishnavas, including Tirumarisi Arva, as we shall see later. This was contested throughout history, but some of the Acharyas established the practice. So, why attribute a Brahmin parentage to Tirumarisi Arva when he clearly states that he's an outcast, especially since the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas do not particularly worry about an Arva being an outcast? Okay, my working theory. I'm not saying this is the truth. I don't know. I was just thinking, I thought this is my working theory. My working theory is that you can see the dates between, this is the academic dates, right? If you're a believer, then the dates of the Arvas would be in the way further back in the past. So my working theory is that it was all about who gains entry inside a temple. Of course, I could be completely wrong. I'm happy to receive suggestions. Now, all the Arvas seem to have entered shrines freely. They frequently describe the Mula Beras, the main deities, and there's no mention of caste being a barrier to entering a shrine in their poems. The Varna system may not have consolidated itself deeply in the Tamil land yet, or at least untouchability may not have been there at all. There may have been differences, but it was not hierarchical, maybe. Whereas it had in the later period when the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas lived and thrived. So maybe an outcast was not allowed inside a temple because it was thought by their time, it was thought to compromise the ritual purity of the temple. But now I think that it's likely that in the 6th and 7th centuries, during the times of the early Arvas, the shrines were very basic structures. Open air shrines under a tree or small structures with a few pillars and a roof, like the hundreds of shrines of goddesses and snakes and the village deities that dot the Indian landscape even today. And there's another example from roughly Tirumal Arva's time, but from Nepal, all the way from Nepal. As you can see, we have here Vishnu lying on the serpent bed. There are 4 posts and a canopy, and the deity is visible from all the sides. You can see him even from outside. We're not allowed to take photographs from the inside. You can go out and take photographs, for example. So even if during the Arva period of time, if this was the kind of structures that the temples had, the shrines had, even if someone wanted to and managed to stop somebody else, and I don't think they did, would have been very easy. People could very easily have seen and worshipped God from afar, which the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas many centuries later may not have realized, because in their own times, the temples progressively were becoming imposing structures. The Cholas were there and all that. Not just the Cholas, but definitely the Cholas. So sometimes these were like virtual fortresses, like this wall temple near Madurai. Therefore, the Sri Vaishnavas may have projected their own values and realities onto people who lived many centuries before them and felt the need to explain away why and how the Arvas supposedly offer lower part of the caste system came to enter these shrines. So that could be why they may have made Tirumal Brahmin born, which would have made his entry inside the shrines tolerable, if not legitimate. This is just my theory. I might be completely wrong, but this is what I thought. They use similar theories with Tirupanarvar and Nammarvar too. For example, Tirupanarvar did not try to enter the Srirangam temple till he was absolutely made to do it by divine will, and even then he was carried on the shoulders of a Brahmin so that his body did not touch the temple premises. And Nammarvar, the problem was solved by claiming that he sat under a tamarind tree throughout his life. He didn't move from there, and the deities from all the places that he sang about in his verses actually came and gave him darshan. In other words, he saw them all in his mind. So this issue related to the access into the temple may have pushed the Sri Vaishnavas to interpret differently Tirumal Arva's clear statement on his caste. Although I'm still wondering about Tirumangai Arvar. I still haven't figured out. Anyway, this has been quite a digression. Now let us move on and have a look at Tirumal Arva's another verse, which tells us something about his religious background. So characteristically, Tirumal is blunt when stating what and who he believes in and who he considers as the others, the Jains, Buddhists, Shaivas, and he categorically states that if you're not devoted to Narayana, then you're not just wrong. Of course, you're wrong, but you're also lowly. So here's the verse. Ariyar Samanar, Ayartar Bavuttar, Siriyar Sivapattar, Seppil, Veriyaya Mayavanai, Malavanai, Madavanai, Yetar, Inavare, Adalal Indra. The Jains are ignorant. The Buddhists are confused. To tell the truth, those who have fallen for Shiva are lower still. Those who do not praise the fragrant Dark Lord, Mal, Madhava, are therefore base people now. Now, I have 2 comments here to make. Knowing God, knowing what is the truth, knowing about the truth of God is important to Tirumal Arva, as we shall see again and again in his poetry. He often uses the verb ari. You can see it in the first line here. It's in the negative form, to know, ari, to know, or a synonym. The reproach he makes to Jains and the Buddhists here is that they don't know the truth. They don't know who the true God is. So his is, a more intellectual kind of bhakti, not yet tinged with too much emotion like the later Arvas. Like Tirupanarva, whom you met, he says ayo twice. No, not Tirumal Arva. No. The second comment I wanted to make is that if you notice carefully, the Shaivas fare much worse than the Jains and the Buddhists. I'll come back to that in a minute. But this sort of anti-heretical impulse was quite common at that time. So here's one of the nicer verses by Tirumal Arva's contemporary, I suppose, the Shaiva Sambandar. I'm just going to read a part of the translation, the part in blue. Sambandar asks Shiva, what is this nature of yours that enjoys seeing the Buddhists and the lowly Jains speak falsehood and become insane? So you can see, similar ideas. The Tamil Jain text, I'm very sure, probably also reciprocated this kind of feeling. What is notable here is that Sambandar doesn't abuse the Vaishnavas. And I think this is quite interesting, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And let's now, I know that suddenly I'm moving on to a second part, but there's a very good reason for this. Because I'm going to here focus on more provocative verses. And the verse that we just read by Tirumari Sarva, in which he abuses the Jains, Buddhists, etc., is the same verse that I'm going to use in 2.1, harsh words for the others, so that I can save some time by reusing the same verse. And then after I'm done with that, I'll move on to 2.2. So this verse that we just saw, the Shaiva poet, as I said, does not include the Vaishnavas in the list of insane, stupid, whatever kind of people, along with the Jains and the Buddhists. This is something I have found to be generally the case with the Shaiva poets, who somehow spare the Vaishnavas, whatever may the reason be, as opposed to the Arvas. It's not just Tirumari Arva. I won't get into that though. What I have observed here is that in Tirumari Arva's verses, the wholly others. So I'm here using Gil Ben Herut's terms. He himself borrowed it from another scholar. For example, somebody who's very, very different, wholly different, then they would be the wholly others. For the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas, the Jains and the Buddhists are the wholly others. Whereas between the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas, there were rivals, there were opponent others, there were more things common among them than different. So these are the opponent others. So technically, the Shaivas and Vaishnavas are closer, but the fight was more pungent, at least from the Arva side, when it came to the Shaivas than when it came to the Jainas and the Buddhists. Perhaps not everywhere, but definitely in this part of Tirumari Arva's verse. So as I said, the Jains and the Buddhists seem to fare better than the opponent others, the Shaivas. Okay, who were fellow Astikas, possibly also fellow Vaidikas, not always, but definitely quite often. Actually, more than the Shaivas, it's Shiva who himself fares quite badly throughout Tirumari Arva's work, as the poet never misses an occasion to show that Shiva is inferior to Vishnu, and to an extent, Shiva is inferior to himself, the Arva, as we shall see later. But before we move on, let's look at another verse. Now, this verse is not found in any of the two works by Tirumari Arva, but it is attributed to Tirumari Arva, and it's found in the 14th to 16th century hagiographic work, Sri Vaishnava hagiographic work, called the Arairapadi Guru Parampara Prabhavam. So that verse makes Tirumari Arva claim this. Sakyam Katrom, Saman Katrom, Sankaranarakiya Ahamanul Araindom, Pakiyatal Senkan Karyane Serdom, Yanti Dilame Ingatku Ariyadu Unjil. So we learned the doctrine of Shakya, we learned Jainism, we examined the doctrinal treatise created by the Honorable Shankara. Out of good fortune, we joined the Dark Lord with red eyes. We are free from evil, nothing is hard for us. So again, you can see whatever the Arva says in his poetry, I think the spirit is taken in this verse, and the verse that has been created in the hagiographic text sort of reflects the Arva spirit, with an emphasis on knowledge, because he's gone on from one faith to another and studied all these different faith systems. And also, Shiva is duly demeaned. And I think, as I said, although this is not a verse by Tirumari himself, it definitely expresses his spirit. Now, Tirumari's aggressive stance towards Shiva and Shaivism makes me wonder whether the story, the later hagiographic stories like the Panirairapadi Guru Parampara Prabhavam or the Prapannamritam, suggest that before becoming a Vaishnava, he was turned into a Sri Vaishnava by Poige Arva himself. And before that, Tirumari Arva was an ardent Shaiva, a poet very similar in style called Shivavakyar. I don't know if this was true because sometimes you have the zeal of the convert who needs to who feels the need to prove himself. I don't know. That's again another hypothesis by me. Um, do Tirumalisai's words betray the zeal of the Shaiva who turned Vaishnava, who felt the need to prove himself? I don't know. I need to look into this further. But in the meantime, I just wanted to tell you a quick anecdote. From the Shaiva side, it's claimed that the Arvar, Tirumalisai Arvar, actually turned into a Shaiva later on, no less than a Siddhar called Sivavakya, who has written more than 500 verses that look and sound very much like the Tiruchanda Virutam. I have put a photo of the published edition of that. But enough digressions here. Let's move to the next subpart to see that Tirumalisai doesn't just disapprove of other gods and their devotees, but also people who do not adhere to his worldview. Nothing to do about God and the divine, but if you're a person and you do things he doesn't like, he's going to criticize you. I'll take one such example. In this verse, Tirumalisai claims that he will not praise another human being and that the person who deserves to be sung by him is God himself. So he says, "Na kondu manidam paadeen, nalamahat தீக்கொண்ட செஞ்சடையான் சென்று என்றும் பூக்கொண்டு வல்லவாரேத்த மகிழாத வைகுந்தச் செல்வனார் சேவடி மேல் பாட்டு." So he says, "I shall not sing of mankind with my tongue. My songs will be on the red feet of the Lord of Vaikuntha, who did not condescend to be pleased, as Shiva, with fire-like red matted locks, carrying flowers, goes to forever extol him as much as possible." So the humans referred to here, who are supposed to be praised, are probably the high and mighty, the potential patrons for the poets. I'll come back to this in a moment. The poet, the Tirumalisai expresses his loyalty, undying loyalty to Narayana, but he also uses the occasion to belittle Shiva, and thereby implies that not just humans, he would not consider praising other gods like Shiva either. As the latter himself, Shiva himself depends on Narayana for obtaining what he wants. And to add insult to the injury, the Arva also implies that despite trying, Narayana will not be easily pleased by Shiva, who offers him flowers, as opposed to Tirumalisai Arva, with whose verses he will be very pleased. Anyway, I think that his categorical statement in line 1, when he says, "I shall not sing of mankind with my tongue," it's a categorical statement, and it is an oblique way of criticizing other poets who lived before him during the Sangam period, during his times, and who will go on living after his times, who depended on a patron to support them financially, and who therefore sang in praise of kings and chieftains and wealthy men. So in the Sangam period, for example, the wandering bards depended on such patrons for their livelihood. For example, here's a poet by Avvayar, whom we all know, a Sangam poetess, a woman poet, and her words about the chieftain cum patron called Adiyaman. She says that however many times she goes to this chieftain and however many friends she takes along, he always welcomes them all nicely. And also, whether he gives rewards for their poems immediately or not, it's not a problem because they're as good as given. So no need to worry that he might turn away a poet or forbear from, giving gifts. He will give gifts. So let me very quickly read this translation by A.K. Ramanujan. "He welcomes us still, as on the first of days, though we go there, not just 1 day or 2 days, but many days, with many friends, does Adiyaman Ani, of the jeweled elephant and the artful chariot. Whether the time for gifts comes right now, or is put off later, it's like fodder left in reserve on the elephant's tusk, always there at hand, waiting. It won't become a lie, wishful heart. Do not scramble for it. Bless him, his works." So no further comments on this verse, just that Tirumalisai writes in this context that he knows very well, and his exclusive and firm devotion to Narayana is apparently making him berate a system established centuries ago, and one that will go on existing well into the modern period. Now, one might think that provocative verses would be reserved for Shiva, that the other religious, the people from other religions and fellow humans who are not devoted to Narayana, as we just saw. But no, Tirunalisayarva actually can be quite cheeky even when dealing with or addressing Narayana, to whom he swears absolute devotion, as we shall see in the next topic. In this verse, Tirumalisayarva claims to have no equal, not even God. And he seems to say that the reason why he has no equal is because he knows God and the others do not know God as well as he does, or they do not know him at all. So again, we come back to the theme of knowing, in this case, God. Good knowledge, right knowledge is important. Anyway, this knowledge of God makes his mind priceless. He says, எனக்காவார் ஆர் ஒருவரே எம்பெருமான் தனக்காவான் தானே மற்றல்லால் புனக்காயா வண்ணனே உன்னை பிறரறியார் என்மதிக்கு விண்ணெல்லாம் உண்டோ விலை. Is there anyone equal to me? Our Lord is his own equal, but not mine. Or you with the hue of ironwood flowers from the uplands. The others do not know you. Is the entire sky a suitable prize for my mind? So the poet claims to be unrivaled even by God, probably placing himself and God in two different categories, of which they are the best specimens. Now, this is a verse that betrays the poet's pride and his cheekiness, but it would be a lot more provocative if we read it in the most natural way, by taking the foremost meaning of the root a, எனக்கு ஆவார், ஆவான். You see, the root is a. It means to be, to become. Now, if you're going to read the verse in that way, it's even more provocative. Then this bit would mean, is there anyone for me? Our Lord is for himself, but not for me. You know, of course, this would be profane, but it would be so like Tirumal if he had meant to indulge in a bit of blame praise, nindastuti. That would be a nice nindastuti. But having said that, the Tamil lexicon gives the meaning to be equal as one of the meanings for are. So to be equal, the way I translated initially, would also work. But the Tamil lexicon gives this particular passage as an illustration to explain that this meaning also exists. So maybe it is a hapax legomenon. It means maybe it's just one occurrence in the whole of literature. Is it possible? Is it possible that the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas understood this verse that way? That's why this meaning has come to exist. Maybe Tirumalisai did not think that way. Not really. Because the first two lines of his verse are almost quoted verbatim from Poigai Arva's Mudal Tiruvandadi 89. It's absolutely, I put that in blue, it's completely repeated. So we actually have a parallel. And we know that Poigai Arva is not given to playful bandying with words or irreverence towards God, or as we know that they were gentle, as the historian Shastri said. He was not like Tirumalisai Arva. So we can definitely take it as meaning that Tirumalisayarva thinks that there's no equal, because there are so few people, virtually no one who knows God. So obviously I'm greater than him. We will see later on what the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas think of this. I'm not getting to that just as yet. It's also possible that this verse is elliptical, and all we need to do is supply a word like oppu, meaning comparison. எனக்கு ஒப்பு ஆவார் ஆர் ஒருவரே, who will be comparable to me. I don't know. I'm getting into too much details here. I should not. Let's just move on. So let's read another verse in which Tirumalisayarva goes a step further and claims that while he does not exist without God, God does not exist without him either. So he also states that God's graces is his, however much time it takes in coming. Okay, so he makes two very interesting statements here. Indraha nalayeyaha inichiridum nindraha ninnarul en palade. நன்றாக நான் உன்னை அன்றியிலேன் கண்டாய் நாரணனே, நீ என்னை அன்றியிலை. Whether it comes today or tomorrow or be slightly delayed, your grace is mine. Look, O Narayana, I indeed do not exist without you. but you do not exist without me either. Now, in the first two lines, we feel an unmissable sense of entitlement. But if you remember, these first two lines also echo Avvaya's words when she says that Adyaman's gifts will come sooner or later, but they're sure to come. They're as good as ours, even if he hasn't given them yet. So Tirumai Searva replaces the king with God and also the material gifts with God's grace. Okay, so it's always there because he is a product of that culture, of that literature. And in the next two lines, the last two lines, Tirumari Searva expresses a certain mutual need for their respective existence because God and devotee are reciprocally relating figures. For example, we can't speak of a husband if he didn't have a wife, right? And vice versa. Same. If there's no servant, you can't speak of a master. Similarly, if there's no devotee, there can be no God. So it is correct that God and devotee are mutually dependent in that sense. And although he is cheeky, Tirumarisai also expresses what we would call urimai in Tamil, which is privilege of intimacy, liberty on the ground of friendship, because he definitely feels so very close to God as to be irreverent. He's like, oh, he's just my friend. He's the closest being that I love the most. So of course I can say that of him. But this verse can also be understood. That's just my interpretation. That's not by the Acharyas or by the Sri Vaishnavas, just me. This verse, I think, can also be understood as God being dependent for his existence on a devotee who defends and establishes him as God, especially when there are rival gods around. Now, as I said, it's not a traditional understanding. This is mine. Because this verse reminded me of a floating verse in Sanskrit by Udayana, a Nayayika of the, I think, 10th century, who speaks like this to God. I think he went to a temple and then they barred. Some people say it's Tirupati, some people say it's Puri Jagannath, and the priest stopped him. And then he got so annoyed that he said this. Aishwarya madamattosi mam avajnaya vartase. Oh, there is another variant. Mam na janasi Keshava, upasthiteshu bauddheshu madadhina tavasthitihi. He says to Keshava, you are drunk with the intoxication of sovereignty. You ignore me. When the Buddhists appear, your existence will depend upon me. Now, this sounds like Tirumari Searva's voice to me. I'm just saying to me, not to everybody. Now, this kind of self-confidence, if not overconfidence, pushes Tirumari Searva to be also peeved at not being received by the deity himself in Tirukudandai, modern-day Kumbakonam. And after asking God why he's not getting up, is it due to fatigue accumulated during one of your incarnations? He orders him to get up and speak. நடந்த கால்கள் நொந்தவோ நடுங்க ஞாலமேனமாய் இழந்தமை குலுங்கவோ விலங்குமால் வரைச்சுரம் கடந்த கால் பரந்த காவிரி கரை குடந்தையுள் கிடந்தவார் எழுந்திருந்து பேசுவாழி கேசன். Did the feet that walk hurt? Was the body which scooped out the trembling earth becoming a bore shaken? Rise from your reclining posture in Kudandai on the banks of the Kaveri with extensive channels which cross big obstructing mountains and difficult deserts, and speak. May you prosper, O Keshava. The first reference is to maybe Rama or even Vamana, who walked across the land, and his manifestation as a boar, Varaha, that saved the earth. And after questioning God, Tirumarise orders him to get up and answer him. As we shall see later, the story is that the Archamurti of Perumal did rise to obey him, but we'll get to that later. So we can see that this kind of verses are different from direct rebuke. I hope you feel that he's cheeky, he's playing, he's bandying with Perumal, he's playing with Perumal, right? He's not exactly very respectful, he's not getting emotional, oh, I'm missing you. No, he's just playing. But this is very different from direct rebuke, because that kind of rebukes against God also exist in Tamil Bhakti poetry. And it's also very different from the Nindastiti, praise in the form of blame. Because I think this kind of cheeky verses for God seem rather rare, especially before Tirumari Searva, his time. Although we do find a few after his time. For example, a verse by Sundarar, a 9th century Shaiva Tamil saint poet. Here, the poet first tells Shiva that his devotees worship him whether he rewards them or not, and that he's not helping them. And finally, wonders whether they could mortgage him if they need money to eat food. Okay, I was going to read the translation, but I'm probably going to just skip the translation because although it begins like a blame phrase and in Dastute, this verse actually ends on a sarcastic note. And although it sounds similar to Tirumarisi Arva's voice, it's actually quite different, as I said, because Tirumarisi Arva never expresses reproach or bitterness. He's so sure about being the recipient of God's grace sooner or later, and is content to wait. Remember, he said, doesn't matter how long you take. Finally, you'll have to give your grace to me. Who else can you give it to? Is there anybody as good as me? Huh, you know? So far we have seen a few cheeky verses by Tirumalai Arva, which sound like the voice of an overconfident devotee who's very secure, very sure of his intimacy with God, and who knows that he won't offend God, or he doesn't care if he did offend him. Now we shall move on to the last and the third part, and focus on what the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas make of the poet and his words. And I'll mostly be using the verses that we have already seen. Only one new verse, but I'll be reusing the same verses. It will save us some time. And I'll also see how those verses are interpreted by the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas in two different types of literature. One in their commentaries, Vyakhyanas, and the other in their Guru Paramparas, hagiographic stories, okay, when they're writing. One when the Vyakyatas are commenting on his words, on the other when other acharyas are writing or trying to tell the life story of the Sarva. Both of them use his words. Ultimately, they all use his words and the kind of spirit that comes out of his words. But what they make of it is very, very interesting, different. That's a spoiler alert. Now, let's begin with the Sri Vaishnava theological commentaries. Both the works attributed to Tirumalai Arvas have been commented upon the Vyakhyana Chakravarti Piriyavachan Pillai, a 13th century very prolific commentator who used a highly Sanskritized form of Tamil called the Manipravalam. This is the Tamil Sri Vaishnava Manipravalam, and I'll mainly be using his commentary here, although I'll also mention a modern commentator. So we have seen that Tirumalai Arva comes across as proud, probably even arrogant in some of his verses. But as a general rule, Pirivachan Pillai seems to want to explain this differently, even if it means taming the poet's voice, as we shall see now. Now, this verse that we saw, is there anyone equal to me? Our Lord is his own equal, but not mine. Now, Pirivachan Pillai adds two sub-clauses. I've given those sub-clauses in blue here to explain why Tirumalai Arva does not have an equal. Because his protector is God. Okay? And why is even God not equal to Tirumalai Arva? Because Tirumalai Arva has God as his protector, and because God does not have anyone to protect him, right? So Tirumalai Arva cannot be compared with God, maybe because they are so very different. Now, let me read this part of the commentary. He says, Emperaman Rakshakan endrikira எனக்கு ஒருத்தர் எதிருண்டோ ஈஸ்வரன் தனக்கு ஒருவன் ரக்ஷகன் உண்டென்று இராமையாலே அவனும் எனக்கு ஒப்பன்று. So is there anyone equal to me, meaning here Tirumalai Arva, who consider God as my protector? Because the Supreme Being does not have a protector for him, he is not equal to me either. Now, we could understand this as God having a certain lack. Okay, so something is lacking in him in the sense that he doesn't have what Tirumalai Arva has, but I'm not sure that the Pirivachan Pillai intended that meaning. Anyway, Pirivachan Pillai wants to make sure that people do not mistake Tirumalai Arva, take him too literally. Actually, a modern commentator goes a step further. This is Prativadi Bhayankaram Anangaracharya, who goes out of his way to explain that even if this part of the verse comes across as arrogance, ahankara, this is not the kind of pride or arrogance that affects lesser mortals like ourselves, because being proud about being a devotee is not a bad thing. He says, Ivvahankaram heyamandra upadheyamam. Satvika ahankaram enapadum. He says this ahankara, this I-ness, is not bad. It is acceptable. It is called satvika I-ness. It's virtuous. So both commentators seem to explain away the perceived arrogance of Tirumal as they can't have. Probably the reason, I think that's what I think. I could be wrong. I think they can't have an Arva display what seems to be a negative quality, right? Being so cheeky, upfront with God. Because the Arvas might, they are supposed to set an example. You don't want to mislead people because every Tom, Dick, and Harry might start saying that to God, and that won't work. It did work for Tirumari Sarva, but not for everybody. We can notice here that there is a continuation in that sense between the 13th century Pillai, Periyavachan Pillai, and the 20th century commentator here. They are much, much closer, despite the 700 years that separate them, more so than between Periyavachan Pillai and Diyarva himself. But anyway, let's now move on to the next verse. And Pillai's interpretation of it is equally interesting. We saw this, remember? Look, O Narayana, indeed I do not exist without you, but you do not exist without me either. Remember this? I don't know if I'll have enough time for this. Maybe I should skip it, but I'll just summarize this for you. Let's see what Pillai makes of it. He presumes that the original verse is elliptical, meaning there are bits and pieces that the Arvas leaves out, and it's the commentator's job to fill in the gaps. And Periyavachan Pillai therefore gives a lot of elucidation, which I have everything that he supplied, all the ideas he has supplied, I have given in blue here. See, he and he actually, I think, in the process he changes deeply the meanings of Tirumarisi Arva's very spirited words to a large extent. For example, he says that because I, meaning Tirumarisi Arva, recognized as being utterly destitute. Whenever did Tirumarisi Arva consider himself utterly destitute? He doesn't. Because I, utterly, who am considered as utterly destitute, do not have another recourse but you who are complete, Purnan, do not have any recourse other than me, an incomplete one. This bond cannot disappear due to your essential nature as God and mine as devotee. I know this is not very easy because we're getting deeper into theology, but basically what he says is that Tirumarisi Arva has God as his sole recourse. Therefore, God has no choice but to need Tirumarisi Arva in turn, because it's God's nature to hang on to the devotee. And although God is complete in every way, he's a Purnan, Paripurnan, and therefore technically he doesn't need anything. And although the Jivatma is incomplete in all the ways, the moment the Jivatma seeks God and no one but him, God also starts needing the Jivatma. And Pillai adds in the last sentence that this mutual dependence is due to their respective essential natures, which also depends on God's Sankalpa. Even God cannot break his own Nitya Sankalpa, his eternal Sankalpa. Anyway, I'm not going to read this. So again, I think I have a feeling that Periyavachan Pillai is making sure that Tirumarisi Arva comes across as saying the proper thing, the right thing. So in a way, his voice has been tamed, I feel. Okay, the same goes for his interpretation of this verse. Nadanda kalgal nondavo, did the feet that walk hurt, etc. At the end, he even orders God to get up and speak to him. Well, Periyavachan Pillai explains this as the Arva being genuinely concerned for the well-being of the deity. And that's why he asks those questions. Are you sure? Are you okay? So they would not be rhetorical questions for him. And then he asks God to get up and speak to him to make sure that he is fine. Well, indeed, Pillai uses the term parivu. It means affection, an emotional kind of concern that you have for someone, an affectionate kind of concern. But the thing is, it's a word that is usually used for Periyarva, who's a highly emotional poet, who always worries about Krishna's well-being and safety. We speak of Pungu Parivu for him, overflowing affectionate concern. And I really don't think that this word would fit with Tirumarisi Arva. But anyway, that's how Periyavachan Pillai saw him. Now, this main deity of Tirukudandai, remember when he says, get up, Keshavam? The story is that this Archamurti, this icon in Tirukudandai, started rising to obey the devotee who's so loyal to him, fiercely loyal to him. So he has, to show that that loyalty. He, respond to that loyalty. So after he started getting up, a reassured Tirumal stopped the process by saying the blessing Vari. And the icon, that Murti, that Chamurti, has remained in that half-risen posture. I can't really see it that way. Maybe it's visible without the clothes. But we'll come back to the story in a few minutes if we have the time. Now, one final point I wanted to make for this commentary section is that at times, Pillai provides a theological interpretation where the passage may not need that at all. Here's an example. I know it's 50 minutes, so I'll try to wrap it up as soon as I can. This is a nice verse, a new one that I'm going to introduce here, in which basically the poet says the main structure is that Srirangam is the town of the Lord. And Lord here is Rama, okay? But the rest, the first paragraph, it's a description of Srirangam. And in this paragraph, it's a description of Srirangam, the natural beauty, the landscape, etc. Okay? So, கொண்டை கொண்ட கோதை மீது தேனுலாவு கூனி கூன் உண்டை கொண்ட ரங்க போட்டி உள்மகிழ்ந்த நாதனூர் நண்டை உண்டு நாரை பேரவாளை பாய நீலமே அண்டை கொண்டு கெண்டை மேயும் அந்த நீரரங்கமே. Isn't that enchanting, the rhythm and the beauty of the verse? Okay, Srirangam, with beautiful cool water, where as the heron moves away after eating the crab and the scabbard fish leaps, a barber's fish roams about, securing the help of the blue Nilumbo. So that Srirangam, which is like this, is the town of the Lord who rejoiced at heart by dispatching thoroughly an earthen wall at the hump of the hunchbacked woman. This is a reference to Mandara in the Ramayana, around whose garland and chignon bees wander. It's a story that's told only by the Arvas, I think, that Rama used to play by, as shooting earthen balls onto Mandara's hunchback, and that's why later on she had her revenge by banishing him to the forest. Anyway, let's focus for the moment on the part in grief. So this is the kind of description of a natural setting, a landscape that is standard in Bhakti verses and often does not mean anything, not necessarily, not for me at least. It's very different for the Vyakyatas. Although in the Sangam poetry, the poets also use the fauna and the flora for the Ullurai Uvamam. Ullurai Uvamam is implied simile, a technique that consists in using a natural scene, the fauna and the flora, for example, to describe actions and emotions and characters and so forth. If we take an example, we don't have the time for an example, but anyway, this is a lovely verse from the Kuruntokai. It's an early 3rd, 4th century Tamil verse from a Sangam anthology called the Ettutohai. Here, a young girl is telling her friend that she met a man and they immediately consummated their mutual attraction. And now she worries about whether he would keep his promise that he had made, since the lovemaking had no witness except for a heron looking for prey. She says, Yarum illai tane kalvan tanadu poyin yavan yavan seho தினைத்தாளன்ன சிறுபசுங்கால ஒழுகுநீர் ஆறல் பார்க்கும் குருகம் உண்டு தான் மணந்த ஞான்றே. So there was no one but the thief himself. If he deceives me, what shall I do? There was only a small heron with green legs like millet stalks, looking for sand eels in the flowing water when he united with me. Here, the role of the flora and fauna is very clear. The heron that is intent upon catching the fish reflects the man intent upon taking her nalam, which is her virtue. But how can the fauna and flora be interpreted in Tirumarisai's verse? Now, I have made a list of all the essential elements, right? But I think this is complicated, so I've made a drawing for you how Pillai interprets this verse. So this pond is the samsara. The crab that is here is worldly pleasure. And the heron is the jivatma that becomes afflicted with ahankara by consuming the crab, which is the worldly pleasure. Okay. The scabbard fish here is the upasaka, somebody who undertakes the bhakti yoga. So they take their own responsibility for their own moksha. So they have stopped consuming material objects. So they have some advantage. But they still have a little bit of ahankara because they are actors in their own liberation. They undertake the bhakti yoga themselves, right? So they are worried that they might get caught by ahankara. Now, the barber's fish here is the prapanna, is the person who has surrendered unto God, who seeks the refuge of the blue Nilumbo. It's the blue God, it's Narayana. And therefore, it stays free and secure and happy under his protection. Now, of course, when dealing with a text, we can offer any interpretation so long as it's logical, whether the author intended that meaning or not. The same goes for Pirivachan Pillai's theological explanation of what seems to me just as a description of a very fertile and pleasant place. Having said that, where Pirivachan Pillai himself may have realized that some people might object to this reading and says that if you do not take the description of the natural setting as being symbolic, but just as a description, then the verse would be of no use to you. Anyway, it seems to me on the whole that when something passes through the lens of the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas, especially the commentators, that thing becomes proper, prim and proper and of religious importance. In this case, they seem to create new works altogether. It seems that we're not talking about the same verses. But I have worked with Pirivachan Pillai's other commentaries, and usually he doesn't do that. He sticks close to the text. But I think it's the cheekiness of Tirumari Sayarva that worries him. He doesn't want to convey, he doesn't want Tirumari Say to be apparently conveying the wrong messages. Now, time is ticking further. Let us turn our attention to the second part of this last part, which is subpart, which is the hagiographic text to see how Tirumari Sayarva is perceived by them. I'll mostly be using Pinbarage Perumal Ji's Arayarapadi Guru Parampara Prabhavam, 14th century, 16th century. It's not very clear. A couple of words on this literature. In a way, that reminds us of Mark Twain. He said that the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas actually never let the truths get in the way of a good story, especially when they did not possess the hard facts, as in the case of Tirumari Sayarva. When they have enough facts to go with, their writing is relatively more trustworthy, like when they write about the Acharyas, who were actually closer to them in terms of time than the Arvas who lived way before them. Now, to get back to Tirumari Sayarva, some of the stories, I won't have the time to tell them here. Some of the stories narrated in these Guru Parampara texts are directly based on his words, even though greatly exaggerated. For example, in his verses, we saw how he belittles Shiva, for example. And then he also thinks that Narayana is the only grantor of moksha. Now, this takes the form of a big story in which there's a clash between Shiva and Tirumari Sayarva. There's literally fiery battles. Each of them, tries to burn the other down between him and Shiva in the Guru Parampara Prabhavam, of course, which Tirumari Sayarva wins, of course. So you have that sort of thing that happens in hagiographic text. And also, I'm going to skip this. There's just not enough time. And there's the story of Kani Kannan, which is, you can't find anything about that in the Arva's poetry. But, well, as I was going to say, on some occasions, the hagiographers write stories based not on the words of the Arva, but rather on the Arva spirit. Whatever he says, they understand him instinctively, you see. They understand and they capture him well and his spirit, and then, here comes the story. So I'm speaking as an academic. Of course, what I believe as a practicing Sri Vaishnava is a different thing. So this story, actually, there is a children's book, which I have given here, not the whole story, but a part of it. So the story is that at one point, Tirumari Sayarva lives in Tiruvekka near Kanchipuram with his disciple called Kani Kannan. And while living there, Tirumari Sayarva turns an old woman who served him into a young woman. The local king marries her, and then learning the truth from her, he approaches Kani Kannan and tells him to ask Tirumari Sayarva to turn him young too. Kani Kannan refuses. He says, no, my master never sings of any human being. Remember, we saw that verse about that. So he won't sing about you. So the king banishes Kani Kannan from Tiruvekka. Tirumari Sayarva says, I can't live without my disciples, and he decides to leave. But he's not going to go alone. He wants to take the Lord of Tiruvekka along with him. That Lord is known as Yathoktakari for various reasons. Sumna Varnam Seda Perumal, he who obeyed what he was told. There's another story earlier on, but the second occurrence in which he obeyed was this. Because when the Arva said, come on, get up, he got up, took his serpent bed and went behind Tirumari Sayarva. There's a verse here which is attributed to Tirumari Sayarva in the Guru Parampara Prabhavam, which we don't find in his two works. I'm not going to read this because we are definitely out of time. So all I'm saying here is that God obeys him and they all leave, as a result of which the king's city plunges into darkness. So the king begs Kanikannan to return, who begs Tirumarisai to return, who asks Perumal to return. So there's a tweaked verse. Pogindran becomes Pokorindan and all that. So basically he says, okay, fine, we are going back to Turveka. Come on, pack up, let's go. And then God comes back. And just to mark the event, he decides to lie down in the reverse reclining position. Reverse reclining is a term that Vasudha Narayanan uses for this posture. As you can see, he lies differently. Um, so anyway, we can see here that the devotee and God are good friends. They are equals, in fact. And once again, Tirumarsiarva is seen as giving God orders, as he does in his real verses, and those orders are also obeyed. So that's probably because Tirumarsiarva is a Sinna Pulak, and you see he's a bold poet with a tongue of integrity, fierce loyalty towards Narayana, which means that Narayana is also reciprocating. And we can definitely see here that um, the hagiographic story actually has captured the true spirit of Tirumarisiarva. I won't have the time to get into this because there is also, I think there is an impact of Tirumarisiarva's story based on his verses, but also based on iconography, but I won't get into that. So I think it's time to conclude. Um, so just to recapitulate and then wrap up, we saw that Tirumarasayarva's verses show that he was a staunch Vaishnava who had a particularly condescending attitude towards Shiva. We also saw that he was arrogant with the other people, other gods, but also cheeky with his own favorite god. So that's part of his personality. He's fiercely devoted to Narayana. That also comes out from his verses. I hope I have given you some idea of it. I have done a lot of blah, 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 but I hope that some of the verses that you read with me were useful to you. I think this is what makes him stand out among all the other Arvas. And although his voice may have been slightly tamed by the later medieval Sri Vaishnava commentators, the Sri Vaishnava hagiographers make the most of an Arva who seems larger than life with a colorful personality. Although they seem to use what I like to call the hagiographic license, like the poetic license, to give vent to their own imagination and magnify it and exaggerate it, a few things. Now, on the whole, I think Tirumarisiarva was not just an accomplished poet, but one with a certain freshness and vigor about him, which exists till our day, and all the Vaishnava acharyas absolutely love him. Thank you so much for listening to this. I hope this was useful to you. And yeah, let me stop sharing if I can. I need to get back here. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much, Sukanya ji. Very involved presentation on Mercy Alward. She started with the geographic stories. That itself was very interesting. Presenting his uh, being born as the Brahmin parents brought up by the Shudra community, but how he's been as Avarna, that part we'll have to debate probably. And but here you don't have an Alva who is mourning over the status, the lower social status. Instead, he celebrates that, and then she moves on to the very interesting poems. Beautiful, lovely, uh, the so called irreverent, cheeky poems, as she has told us. Enmadikki vinnallam undo vilaya. Beautiful. One, one has to be very cheeky to say that. And there are several such. And then she compared, contrasted it with Ninda Stuti. And that Udayana story was also like, you will need me when the Bauddhas wow, it was also very interesting. And by and large, the anthropomorphic kind of representation, where a lot, the most interesting towards the close, he was saying that, Lord rolls up his mattress whenever he's been ordered to do so and spreads whenever he is ordered by him, so that, he keeps moving him here and there, and obediently, Lord. Spreads his mattress, fold up, pack up whenever he is asked to by his great Alward. And I believe all your And what I liked was, the interpretation. This is specifically what is demanded. That once the current interpretation by the scholars, and I believe that this is the only way by which the literature can survive. Of course, she has resorted to Pillai's interpretation, but in and through, we heard a lot of Dr. Sukanya's, which stand out as the contribution. Vade Vade Jayate Tata Buddha, through interpretation, that our tradition has been surviving, and this is the only way that we can keep it survive as well. Thank you very much, Sukanya ji. May I request Swamiji to speak a few words and bless us all.
Namaste, Swamiji. Nice to see you.
Narayana, nice to see you too, Ma. But unfortunately, because various worldly things, I joined only 25 minutes ago. So I mean, a little more than half an hour ago. So I missed a lot. So I hope that I've asked Shrikala to record and put on YouTube and we'll see it. But this confidence with which Alvar speaks to Perumal, it's because of that direct experience. That experience, he has seen him, he has known him, and so he commands him. So it's a wonderful thing to read, to hear. Your notes have been very painstaking, and your slides have been also very appropriate and very helpful. So I wish I had heard the whole thing. Maybe I'll be luckier next time you speak. So Narayana, Narayana, Narayana.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji. Parthsarthi, sir, please initiate a discussion. Professor Indra also should be here. One of you can start.
Madam, Professor Padma Srinivasan is there. She is a very good scholar.
Oh, please. Padmaji, please speak. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Padma ma'am. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Very well. Go ahead.
First of all, pranam, Swamiji, and I must congratulate Suganya on lifelong discourse. You have just summed up in 1 hour. Within an hour, you have made us climb. In fact, I was very much afraid of Tirumal, and I always look at him with a distance. And because his Highness personified. So the Highness personified, I always think he is extended to Nammalvar, who says, Tan Sollal Thane Tannai Kirtitamayan. And he is the one who said like that. So I always look at him with great reverence. Thank you, and my blessings to you. When Swamiji is there, I should not bless you. But by age, I can make you bless you. Do well. I'm really, pranam Swamiji, please bless me. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Indra.
It's nice to see you all.
Great, madam. Thank you so much.
We'll be speaking one day in this forum.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Dr. Sukanya?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Humbly I say that I have no right to, I have no qualification to congratulate you because I am not a scholar like you. At the same time, there are certain areas of interest which I share in your presentation. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I have been interested in the last 2 decades or so about the reception of Bhakti literature in hagiographic context and also in anti-hagiographic context, because hagiography produces one kind of literature and that itself is removed. It's twice removed from the original work. As Plato said, see, the reality is twice removed already. In poetry, it's thrice removed, he said. In literature, it's thrice removed. So whatever the poet might have sung, whether it is Amalanadi Piran or Tirumal Alvar, there is a kind of a reception context which has been thickened like Ambalapuram poison, shall we say. By the time it reaches the commentators, they are pious people who are, as Padma said, they're afraid of him. At the same time, they want to co-opt him. Am I right?
Yes.
Even a rebel must be co-opted so that his strength comes to you. Like Rama does not want to lose the strength by fighting Wali directly. That kind of, I don't know, I may be wrong, but some kind of symbolism is there. In the case of other kinds of commentators are not necessarily hagiographers. Hagiography mentioned, see, Guru Parampare, Arayapadi, Pannirandayapadi, and then the Sanskrit Divishwari. So as you go further, this context is thickened by the socio-political, cultural politics, and also divine politics. Because you made a very important point that earlier these temples were not actually very big made, and they were not like corporate houses. Okay, sorry to put it that way, which Ramanuja had to organize in a very managerial excellence and supremacy. On the other hand, they were very close to people. There was not much of difference between the rustic deity and this kind of thing. Later, this kind of accretion endows it with some divinity to that. So when hagiographers have to one kind of purpose to just keep them all together in the flock, that is my one point of it. At the same time, you tend to become a little suspicious about it because you kept on qualifying yourself in all the statements that you made. You remember in the beginning, did it happen this way? Did he mean like this? You remember? I doubt, I do not know very sure. I may be wrong, you are saying. So that shows that the reception context could be, I'm not saying it's secular, but it could be equally religious. Like Saivites, how do they receive him? For instance, I was very embarrassed to listen to Nayanmar's poetry against Buddhists and Jains. The Kanna
Yes.
Bilal.
Oh, yes.
So Professor
Oh,
S.
yes.
Kandasamy gave a wonderful talk in philosophy department. He was my teacher in Annamalai University. Okay, so that is something very. You have to, so one thing that you learn from this tension between the actual poems, whatever spirit in which they've written, and the reception of it in hagiographic and anti-hagiographic context, because the anti-hagiographic context has produced different kinds of literature. You get Nandana's story, for instance. You can produce it in a different way. Tirumal Alvar, Karunanidhi writing a play about Ramanujan. Okay, so somebody can just appropriate Tirupanalvar or Tirumal in a different context. So that is why your talk was interesting, because you did not simply locate the whole interest only in the piety or whatever it is, or even the intransigence of the spirit of this poet. Have I used the word? You have used the word cheeky. I use the word intransigence, because he dares to ask the Lord, who are you? When I'm not there, you are not there, and so on. So Dr. Srikala summed it up very well. So I think that with all this, it is the context which makes it very, very interesting. And the way you read the poem, see, each poem, keeping the rhythm, that's something. Last time my friend asked me, why didn't you read the poem out? I was not sure, because there were great people like T.K. Parsati and so on. Who am I to read before them, I was thinking. But when you just look at it, reading makes a tremendous impact on the listener. He may be a contemporary listener, or he may be or whether it is read the way in which you read it. The Kovil eppadi padipalanu theriyadu, because they may have a different chandas or way of speaking. So thank you so much. I feel that I understood much of what you said because of my interest in way hagiography receives this kind of literature. Thank you. And especially that picture of the pond and Bhagwan, the heron there, and then the various symbological pictorial explanations. Thank you so much, Dr. Kanya, after a long time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Lovely. Any other questions? Parsati sir, are you here? Or
I think he's left. He's left.
He has left. Is there any other question? Meanwhile, I just wanted to ask you one thing. In one of the verses, he has made a reference to Acharya Shankara, right?
No.
that is not-
It's Shankara in terms of Shiva, I think.
Oh, okay. But okay, so the
But
doctrinal.
having said that, it's a verse that is found in the Guru Parampara Prabhavams, not in his own corpus.
Okay. That is much.
So even, the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. So it's not interesting. Maybe, if it was him, then maybe you could have said, oh, did Shankara live in that time? You can try and place.
You placed him in 6th century AD, right?
6th, 7th, yes.
6th, 7th century. But anyway, Shankara is 8th century.
Yeah.
as we place him now. So I was just getting confused.
But I thought you mentioned Shankara, that second.
It's Shiva, Shiva
It's Shiva.
Shankara.
Shankara referred.
Uh,
Shiva has been
that's
referred.
two of
Not,
that were.
not Acharya. Not Acharya. That's
Oh,
what she says.
okay, I see.
But where it is also meant the doctrinal. So I thought that it is
Yes.
philosophical, so I thought that it could be Acharya Shankara himself. So I have yet another concern, like, often you're saying that as an academic and as a religious practitioner. So this division that invariably comes in when we do Sri Vaishnava texts, because uh, with clinical objectivity, if you approach the text, I suppose you get nothing. You'll have to go empty-handed. But at the same time, particularly for you, someone who is working outside India, like you will have to follow the global norms of academics. I'll tell you an instance. When I was asked to write on Badarayana by one encyclopedia people, and they did not like my writing because they said, I mean, you are not objectively writing. You seem participant in the exercise. So, this participatory exercise with which we have been in the Indian context, we have been doing necessarily, and by definition, we think that that is how uh, academics slash religious, they are not in watertight compartments as to be done. So my question is, how do you manage doing this parallelly? Is there a division? How efficiently you make this division? Yes.
Yeah, I think there are many places where the two are compatible. It's not an issue at all because my personal faith feeds my interest. So the more I feel devoted, the more I want to go into Arvar and Sri Vaishnava writings. So without this devotion, I probably would not feel this kind of interest, this impulse to go and make all these works available to everybody. I mean, at least the Arva poetry is available, but the Acharya's writings, there are no translations, for example. So without this backing up by my religious beliefs, I probably would not be so much into it. I would go and explore other parts of Tamil literature or Indian literature. On the other hand, I think that so yes, this feeds the other thing, but at the same time, if I become completely devoted and I start writing that, I have to follow the norms, as you said, of academia. In that case, the devotee in me takes a step back because I can't write, for example, that Tirumal Arva was born in the Dwapara Yuga and that he lived for 4,000 years. I can't write that. That would mean, as a devotee, I can believe what I want, but as an academic, if I write that, then that's it. I have no um, credibility left. Okay, so that is an extreme example, but I try to apply that rigor every time I do that. In my articles, I have also started writing that way. In a footnote, I always write, I'm a practicing Sri Vaishnava, but I, as an academic, also approach the text in a certain way from an academic perspective. So the two, I try to make sure that the two do not clash. At the end of the day, what my faith belongs to me, this is work. After all, academia is work, but I'm trying to put that work into good use in order to make my work credible, so that all these texts that I speak about and translate reach more people, because if I'm not credible, then they would not reach everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that doesn't work. So
Well
that's
argued.
how.
Yeah, yeah, well argued. And who says that Tirumal belongs to Dwapara Yuga, where it has been said? I also read somewhere.
I
Uh,
think it's in the Guru Parampara texts.
Guru Parabha, which is a later
Hmm.
one. It's not.
Yes, 14, 15, 16. Some people say it's even later than that.
Okay.
We haven't come to a consensus. Definitely says, it says he spent 700 years discovering the Buddhism, 700 years or whatever, discovering Jainism and all that. So it's 4,500 years or something like that.
And when Alvar saints are very, I mean, they have all dislikes which is expressed verbally in their poems. Why do you think that Shaivais don't exhibit that way? And this thing dislike for Alvas. I mean, what could be the reason? That's
Uh,
what you
okay.
in the
There could
literature.
be many reasons. Some of the scholars have mainly pointed out that the Shaiva Nayanmar's first line, the Jains stood in the first line of attack of the Shaiva Nayanmars. Okay, the main enemies were the Jains. Okay, the Arvas did not have to confront the Jains immediately. All the nasty work was done by the Shaivas for whatever reason. It's quite possible that some of the Nayanmars are like Karakal Amayar are slightly earlier to the main, to the first Arvas. So they may have come there before, and it's also possible that the local faith. It was at the end of the day, it was also a struggle for patronage.
Hmm.
Okay, it's the patronage struggle was probably at that time more between a Shaiva king and a king that turns Jaina and then back to Shaivism. So that was the main issue. The Vaishnavas were not quite there yet. They
Okay.
reached probably that stage later, probably in the second millennium. But of course, I'm not a historian. A historian would be able to explain this better, but this is how I understand. By the time the Arvas come and start attacking them,
Hmm.
their main rivals are the Shaivas.
Hmm. Okay. That is it. Thank you very much for that. Uh, Shimi, shall we wind up?
Ma'am, I think there is a question in the chat box.
There is a question in the chat box. Can you
Oh,
see, Dr.
yeah,
Sukanya?
yeah, sure. What are the philosophical significance of Tirumarisai? You are asking the philosophical significance of the person or what his philosophy is. As I said, he was
I
more.
asking his poet. I ask if his poetry. What are the philosophical significance of Tirumarisai poetry? Tiruchandavirudham, Nanmugan Tiruvandadi. Emphasize what are the philosophical significance.
Okay, he says many different things because the poems are not linked with each other by the same thing. So whatever the poems are there, they express different ideas. So if you look in general, as I said before, he expresses a kind of bhakti that is more intellectual. That's one thing. Um, and then if you look at his first verses, he's also a person who gets into, he has a larger than real life kind of vision. He sees Narayana in everything. He says Narayana is the one and the one and the one and the one, and he's the two and the two and the two. So he sees Narayana absolutely everywhere. That's one thing he does. It's more theological than philosophical, but I'm more of a theologist
Exactly.
than a.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm not so much of a philosopher, I'm more of a theologist. And he also focuses a lot, Tirumai Sarvar, on the Antaryami. So Narayana as being inside. So he focuses on meditating, on thinking, on knowing. So his, as I said, is intellectual. So Narayana is inside. Of course, he mentions temples. I have picked out some of the verses in which he mentions temples. There are other verses that he does.
Yes, it takes deeper into Tiruchandavartam, I feel, isn't it?
Sorry, ma'am?
This question takes into deeper into Tiruchandavartam.
Yes.
Yes, that's a very difficult text.
It is. It is. I
Yes,
have
yes,
translated the whole text, not published it yet.
exactly. It is very difficult to unravel
Yeah.
Tiruchandavartam. I always find it very
Yes, ma'am.
difficult. I have been just trying years together,
Yes.
not
Yes.
not
Yes.
months, years together, more than 40 to 50 years. I have been just
Okay.
plodding over it. Okay. That's a good
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
question, but
Yes, yes. Yes, actually, I read Tiruchandavirudham, but I feel his philosophy is climax of his mysticism. It's really
exactly.
wondering.
That is very, very difficult. Unless you follow him, it is very, very difficult. I always approach Tirumalai with a distance only. I have been living with
Yes,
Alva for more than 60 years, but I am really afraid even today. Even to approach Sukanya, it was very difficult for me.
No,
Yes,
the reason is I approach him with the acharya's help, and when you have the acharyas to help you, they'll fend for you. You don't have to do anything. So that's
yes,
why.
yes, of
But
course, ma'am,
really,
because
I appreciate you,
I'm
Sukanya, for taking Tirumalizai for your discourse. I really appreciate and I congratulate you because of
Thank you,
my
ma'am.
fear towards him.
I hope you're
thank
not
you,
afraid of him. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
No need to be
thank
afraid
you,
of him. He is wonderful.
Yeah.
yes,
Shmi.
thank you, ma'am, thank you so much. I'm from Kerala University. I do research in Nalara Divya Prabhan. That's why I call that. Okay,
Oh,
Exactly.
thank you,
That is
really,
great.
thank you so much, ma'am.
thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Shimi, please wind up.
Yes, ma'am. Pranam to all. My humble pranam to Swamiji. Many thanks to Swamiji for blessed with this program, Narayana. It is my great pleasure and privilege to propose vote of thanks at the end of this monthly lecture series by Lalita Forum for Vaishnava Textile Studies. This is the second lecture of our forum, and today we had an enlightened lecture by Dr. Suganya Anandakachenin from University of Hamburg, Germany. Dear ma'am, we are extremely grateful to you for this lucid and knowledgeable presentation on Tirumulisai Arvar, and it was really a lovely talk on the great devotee. So, on behalf of the entire group of Lalita Forum, I extend my sincere thanks to you, dear ma'am. Thank you so much. And no words to say thank to our dearest ma'am, Professor Sigla Nair, who is the backbone of this forum. Thank you so much, dear ma'am, for the presidential address. And many thanks to you for being us with always. Many thanks, ma'am. And well, I'm pleased to thank Mrs. Padma Padmanabhan, member of Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation, Chennai, for the nice words of welcome. Thank you so much, ma'am. And I would like to tell thanks to all the seniors, academicians, scholars, and researchers for attending the program and spare their valuable time here. Thank you so much, everyone. Good
I'd
night.
like to finish by thanking also my own Acharyan and Perumal for stopping that sneezing and that sniffing and all that. You notice that it didn't
Oh,
happen.
did
So
have
thank
seen
you so much.
you got so involved in the lecture that
Yes,
I was looking at you how involved you were, and you forgot even your cold.
yes,
All cold has left. Perumal's grace. Yeah.
yes, absolutely, ma'am.
So
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you so much, Swamiji. Thank you for
Thank you.
blessing.
Thank you.
Good night.